Have you ever gotten a raise at work, looked at your paycheck and thought, finally, things should be getting easier now? Maybe you worked extra hours. Maybe you took on more responsibility. Maybe you spent years building your skills just to earn that promotion. And when it finally happened, it felt like proof that all your hard work was paying off. But then something strange happened. A few months later, your financial situation didn't feel much different. Your rent increased. Your grocery bill got more expensive. Gas prices crept up. Insurance costs went higher. And somehow, despite earning more money than you did before, you still felt like you were running on a financial treadmill. Look, you're not imagining it, and you're definitely not alone. Millions of people are experiencing the exact same thing right now. They're working harder than ever, earning more than ever, yet feeling financially stuck. Here's the thing. Most people assume that a bigger paycheck automatically means they're getting richer. But what if that's not actually true? What if the number on your paycheck is growing, while the actual value of that money is quietly shrinking? What if one of the biggest reasons you feel stuck financially has nothing to do with laziness, bad decisions, or lack of effort? What if inflation has been silently stealing your raise this entire time? And today, we're going to uncover exactly how it happens. My name is Demas, and I spend way too much time thinking about money. If you're someone who feels stuck financially, make sure to hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up if this helps you out. Now, let's talk about one of the most misunderstood forces in personal finance. Inflation. Most people think inflation simply means prices go up. And technically, that's correct. But that's also like saying gravity just makes things fall. It's true, but it doesn't explain how powerful the force really is. Here's what most people don't realize. The real danger of inflation isn't that things become more expensive. The real danger is that inflation slowly changes the value of your money while making it feel like nothing has changed at all. You still see the same numbers in your bank account. You still receive a paycheck every 2 weeks. You still get occasional raises. Everything appears normal on the surface. But underneath, the purchasing power of your money may be shrinking year after year. And because the process happens gradually, most people never notice it until they start wondering why life feels more expensive despite earning more than ever before. Look, inflation doesn't destroy wealth overnight. It erodes wealth quietly, slowly, almost invisibly. And that's exactly what makes it so dangerous, because if you can't see the problem, it's almost impossible to solve it. So before we talk about investing, debt, or building wealth, we first need to understand the silent force that's affecting every dollar you earn. If you've spent any amount of time looking for financial advice online, you've probably heard the same recommendations over and over again. Work harder, save more money, get a better job, ask for a raise, pay off your debt, start investing. And look, none of those are bad suggestions. In fact, most of them are genuinely helpful. The problem is that they're often presented as complete solutions when they're really only part of the equation. Here's what most people don't realize. All of that advice assumes your money keeps the same value over time. But that's not how the real world works. Imagine getting a 3% raise and feeling proud of your progress. That's completely reasonable. After all, you're earning more than you were before. But if prices rise by 4% during the same period, you're actually losing purchasing power. You earned more dollars, but those dollars buy less. Think of it like running up a down escalator. You're moving forward. You're putting in effort. You're doing everything right. Yet the surface beneath you keeps moving in the opposite direction. That's inflation. And for millions of workers, that's exactly what's happening. They're working harder than ever before. They're getting raises. They're making more money on paper. But because inflation keeps pushing back, many of them are simply running faster to stay in the same place. And that's why traditional financial advice, while useful, often feels frustratingly incomplete. Because it tells you how to move forward. But it doesn't always account for the force that's constantly pulling you backward. Let's put some actual numbers behind this, because once you see the math, it's hard to unsee it. Imagine you're earning $50,000 per year, and after a successful performance review, your employer gives you a 3% raise. Sounds great, right? Your salary increases to $51,500. Most people stop the calculation there and assume they're moving ahead financially. But inflation doesn't stop there. Let's say inflation during that same year is 4%. In order to maintain exactly the same purchasing power you had before, your income would need to increase to roughly $52,000, not $51,500. That means despite getting a raise, you're actually falling behind. Not because you're spending recklessly, not because you're making bad decisions, but because prices are rising faster than your income. Now you might be thinking, okay, but that's only a small difference. And you're right. For 1 year, it may not seem like a big deal. But here's where it gets really interesting. Inflation compounds, just like investing. Imagine inflation averages around 3% per year over the next decade. Something that costs $1,000 today won't cost $2,300 10 years from now. Because of compounding, it'll cost more than $100 to $340. The same force that helps investors build wealth over time can also quietly erode purchasing power if your money isn't growing. That's why inflation isn't just a temporary inconvenience. It's a long-term financial force. And if your income and assets aren't growing faster than inflation, you're effectively moving backward, even when it feels like you're moving forward. Now you might be thinking, okay, I understand inflation. But what should I actually do with my money? Should I invest it or should I focus on paying off debt first? This is one of the most common financial questions people ask, and unfortunately, it's also one of the most misunderstood, because most people are looking for a universal answer. But personal finance doesn't work that way. Here's the thing. The right answer depends on the math. Let's start with a credit card balance charging 24% interest. Every year that debt remains unpaid, it's growing at a rate that's incredibly difficult to beat consistently through investing. In that situation, paying off the debt is often the smartest move. Why? Because eliminating a guaranteed 24% cost is essentially the same as earning a guaranteed 24% return, and opportunities like that are extremely rare. Now let's look at the opposite scenario. Imagine you have a fixed mortgage with a 3% interest rate. That's a very different conversation. Historically, diversified stock market investments have often produced higher long-term returns than 3%. In that case, aggressively paying off the mortgage may not be the most efficient use of your money. This is where it gets really interesting. Inflation changes how debt behaves. When inflation rises, the future value of money declines. That means fixed-rate debt can actually become easier to repay over time because you're paying it back with dollars that may be worth less than when you originally borrowed them. The goal isn't to blindly invest, and it's not to blindly eliminate every debt. The goal is understanding which choice creates the greatest long-term financial advantage. And that requires looking beyond simple rules and understanding the numbers behind the decision. Now let's talk about something even more important than inflation itself. Psychology. Because understanding the numbers is one thing. Actually changing your financial behavior is something completely different. Here's what most people don't realize. Many of our money decisions are driven by emotions, not logic. And inflation takes advantage of that. The first psychological bias is called loss aversion. Humans naturally hate losing money more than they enjoy gaining money. In fact, studies have shown that the pain of losing $100 feels significantly stronger than the pleasure of gaining the same amount. That's why people often avoid investing. They see the possibility of short-term losses and immediately become uncomfortable, so they leave their money sitting safely in cash. But here's the irony. While they're avoiding visible losses, they're accepting invisible ones. Inflation quietly reduces the value of their money every single year. No warning, no notification, no dramatic market crash, just a slow erosion of purchasing power happening in the background. The second psychological trap is instant gratification. We naturally prefer rewards today over rewards tomorrow. Buying something feels good immediately. Investing requires patience. Saving requires discipline. The reward comes later. This is where inflation makes things even more complicated. When people hear that prices are rising, they often feel pressure to spend faster. They think, maybe I should buy this now before it becomes more expensive. Sometimes that's a smart decision. But often it's simply fear disguised as urgency. And fear rarely leads to good financial decisions. The people who build wealth aren't necessarily smarter. They're usually just better at controlling the emotions that inflation quietly triggers in everyone else. This explains something that frustrates millions of people, and maybe you felt this yourself. You follow the rules. You show up to work every day. You try to budget responsibly. You avoid unnecessary debt. You save when you can. You do everything society tells you a financially responsible person should do. Yet somehow life still feels harder than it should. And eventually you start asking yourself a difficult question. If I'm doing everything right, why don't I feel like I'm getting ahead? Here's what most people don't realize. They're measuring progress using the wrong scoreboard. Most people focus on nominal income, which is simply the number printed on their paycheck. But your lifestyle isn't determined by how many dollars you earn. It's determined by what those dollars can actually buy. That's called real income, and real income is what truly matters. Think about it this way. If your salary increases by $5,000, but your housing costs, food costs, transportation costs, and insurance costs increase by even more, are you actually wealthier? Not really. The number got bigger, but your financial position didn't. Look, your landlord doesn't care that you got a raise. The grocery store doesn't care. The gas station doesn't care. The only thing that matters is purchasing power. And for many people, purchasing power hasn't grown nearly as much as they think. That's why so many workers feel trapped. They're making more money than ever before, but because the cost of living keeps rising alongside their income, financial progress feels like a mirage. Close enough to see, but always just out of reach. Now let's talk about one of the biggest differences between how average people think about money and how wealthy people think about money. And no, it's not because wealthy people have some secret investment strategy that nobody else knows about. It's something much simpler. They understand the power of ownership. Here's what most people don't realize. Many people spend their entire lives focused on income. They work for money. They negotiate salaries. They chase promotions. And there's nothing wrong with that. Increasing your income is important. But wealthy people eventually shift their attention towards something else. Ownership. Ownership of businesses. Ownership of stocks. Ownership of real estate. Ownership of assets that can continue generating value even when they're not actively working. Think about it this way. When you rely entirely on a paycheck, your financial growth is usually tied to your time. You work more. You earn more. You stop working. The income often stops too. But assets operate differently. A business can continue generating revenue. A rental property can continue collecting rent. A stock can continue benefiting from a company's growth. This is where it gets really interesting. Inflation often works against people who only earn income, but it can work differently for people who own assets. Businesses can raise prices. Properties can generate higher rents. Corporate earnings can grow over time. That's why many wealthy people don't just focus on earning money. They focus on owning things that can grow faster than inflation, because they understand a simple truth. Working for money can help you survive. But owning productive assets is often what helps people build lasting wealth. Now let's talk about one of the biggest differences between how average people think about money and how wealthy people think about money. And no, it's not because wealthy people have some secret investment strategy that nobody else knows about. It's something much simpler. They understand the power of ownership. Here's what most people don't realize. Many people spend their entire lives focused on income. They work for money. They negotiate salaries. They chase promotions. And there's nothing wrong with that. Increasing your income is important. But wealthy people eventually shift their attention towards something else. Ownership. Ownership of businesses. Ownership of stocks. Ownership of real estate. Ownership of assets that can continue generating value even when they're not actively working. Think about it this way. When you rely entirely on a paycheck, your financial growth is usually tied to your time. You work more. You earn more. You stop working. The income often stops too. But assets operate differently. A business can continue generating revenue. A rental property can continue collecting rent. A stock can continue benefiting from a company's growth. This is where it gets really interesting. Inflation often works against people who only earn income, but it can work differently for people who own assets. Businesses can raise prices. Properties can generate higher rents. Corporate earnings can grow over time. That's why many wealthy people don't just focus on earning money. They focus on owning things that can grow faster than inflation, because they understand a simple truth. Working for money can help you survive. But owning productive assets is often what helps people build lasting wealth.